Silas Thorne stood alone in the center of the obsidian hall as the translation drone hesitated, its internal gyros whining as it tried to process the lack of diplomatic headers in his speech. He didn't offer a petition for mining rights or a trade mandate. He looked up at the Archon and acknowledged the faint, jagged tremor in her stillness. The silence that followed was a physical weight. What you are about to witness was never meant for the official archives. Some truths are so dangerous they can only be whispered in a room full of enemies. Stay close. The tip of his data stylus had been worn to a flat, jagged nub weeks ago, a small frustration that seemed to matter more than the shifting borders of the hegemony. Back then, Silas was simply a trade observer, recording the fluctuating price of refined iridium while the galaxy moved on, indifferent to his existence. The Obsidian Hall was a cathedral of calculated, ancient cruelty. High above the floor of light-drinking stone, bioluminescent chandeliers dripped violet radiance like slow-acting poison, casting long, hungry shadows across the delegations. Silas sat in the third tier of the observer's gallery, his uniform smelling of ozone and the stale, salty nutrient paste of the transit docks. It was a scent that didn't belong here, not amidst the heavy, spice-laden incense that the Ethelguard used to signal a false diplomatic neutrality. Archon Lyra sat upon the not-quite throne. It was a seat of obsidian and cold iron, designed to deny its occupant even a moment of physical comfort. Her hands rested on the armrests, fingers splayed and unmoving. Silas watched her through the magnification of his terminal lens. Because in the Ethelguard hegemony, a human wasn't a guest, they were a rounding error. That realization usually stung, but today, it allowed him to see what the suitors missed. 22 high-ranking suitors had come for the conclave of unions. One by one, they stepped into the circle. They didn't come to woo, they came to dissect. Hegemon Vark of the Grendelkin spoke for nearly an hour, his voice a rhythmic grinding of tectonic plates. He detailed the decay of Lyra's northern shipyards with the precision of a butcher. He didn't look at her face. He looked at the holographic maps projected behind her, already carving up her territory in his mind. Lyra didn't flinch. Her skin was a translucent, pale cream, but along the delicate ridge of her jaw, the chromatophores were beginning to pulse. It was a subtle shift to a dull, bruised slate gray. To the Grendelkin, it was likely just a trick of the atmospheric lighting. To Silas, it was a scream. He had spent 3 years cataloging the biological tells of the calibrated and the Grendelkin. He knew that specific shade of gray. It was the color of a heart being crushed under the weight of a performance that had gone on too long. The prime adjudicator Valerius called for the next petitioner. The hall was thick with the expectant silence of a theater audience waiting for the final act of a tragedy. Silas looked down at his terminal, his fingers hovering over the trade addendum he was supposed to be filing. He had found it 3 nights ago, buried in the digital sediment of a pre-classical legal archive. A footnote. Article 9 Omega. It was a relic of the old accord, a legal loophole so obscure it had been forgotten by the very council that drafted it. The text was dry, technical, and utterly transformative. It suggested that under specific conditions of unmet sovereign distress, any recognized observer could intercede. It was a strategic liability for the court, a hidden fracture in their perfect architecture. Silas had memorized every word, though he never intended to use it. A clerical error. The central pylon chimed, and the registrar's voice echoed through the hall, distorted by the translation field. The court recognizes the observer from the Terran Trade Coalition. Petitioner Thorne stepped forward. The registrar had misread the cue, skipping the high-ranking emissary from the calibrated. The court froze. 100 alien gaze organs turned toward the third tier, their pupils contracting in the violet light. Silas felt a bead of sweat track slowly down his temple. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He could have corrected the error. He could have sat back down and faded into the comfortable shadows of the gallery. But then he looked back at the Archon's hands. They were still perfectly, unnaturally still on the cold iron armrests, the knuckles white against the dark metal. which meant his presence in the circle wasn't just a mistake, it was a death sentence. Silas stood up. The movement was slow, his joints stiff from hours of motionless recording. He didn't grab his prepared trade report. He left the worn data stylus on the desk. He walked down the long, curving staircase, the sound of his boots on the obsidian floor echoing like gunshots. When he reached the center of the circle, the temperature seemed to drop. It was a microclimate of pure, focused pressure. Archon Lyra looked down at him, her eyes vast and unreadable, though the slate-gray pulse at her jaw grew darker, more frantic. "Terran," the Prime Adjudicator said, his voice dripping with the condescension of a god speaking to an insect. "State your trade petition and be brief. You are a clerical interruption." Silas didn't look at the Adjudicator. He didn't look at the Grendelkin or the Silent, watching calibrated. He looked directly at the woman on the Iron Throne. "I have no trade petition," Silas said. His voice was raspy from disuse, but it carried to the furthest corners of the hall. "I am not here to talk about iridium or shipyards." The translation drone above him stuttered, its internal gears whirring as it struggled to categorize his intent. It was searching for the standard diplomatic headers. It found none. "I am here," Silas continued, his gaze locked on her graying jawline, "because I am a witness, and I see that you are bleeding." The silence in the obsidian hall didn't just linger, it solidified. 60 days of grueling compatibility hearings followed that first eruption of honesty, a period where the Ethelgard elders didn't use poetry to test Silas, but rather an exhaustive biological and psychological autopsy. They placed him in a sensory deprivation chamber where the only sound was the vibration of a cheap, mass-produced heating coil in the floor, a mundane, humming reminder of the industrial world he had left behind. They threw every strategic liability in his face, projecting holographic charts of the lifespan differential that made his very existence look like a clerical error in the face of their millennia-long history. Because the Ethelgard lived for centuries, and Silas Thorne was a flicker of light in a room full of glaciers. He survived the hearings by refusing the strategic performance everyone expected. When the Prime Adjudicator asked what he could offer the Archon that a hegemon could not, Silas didn't talk about fleets or trade routes. He talked about the smell of rain on hot pavement and the way a human heart learns to beat faster when it knows its time is short. He answered their biological attacks with a blunt, exhausting honesty that seemed to confuse their calculating sensors. They were looking for a move on a chessboard, but Silas was simply standing on the board, refusing to be a piece. The foreseeable grief became the Elder's primary weapon. They showed him a projection of Archon Lyra, hundreds of years after his death, still sitting on that iron throne, her skin as cream-colored and smooth as it was now, while he was nothing but dust in a forgotten Terran colony. They asked him if it was cruel to tether a sovereign to a tragedy that would happen in the blink of an eye. They were wrong. Silas didn't blink. He looked at the data reads and acknowledged the math of his own mortality. He told them that the value of a burden wasn't measured by how long you carried it, but by the fact that you chose to pick it up at all. Toward the end of the second month, the proceedings reached their peak. This was the moment where Article 9 Omega, the dormant legal loophole he had excavated from the digital sediment, became his only shield. It was a trade addendum from the pre-classical era, a forgotten footnote which stipulated that in a court of absolute neutrality, the validity of a union was not determined by the adjudicators, but by the sovereign's right to claim a witness to their own internal life. It was a technicality that bypassed every political barrier the hegemony had spent centuries building, a single sentence of ancient law that recognized the Archon not as a political asset, but as a person. And now, back in the center of the hall, the translation drone still whirred with that same uncertain hum. The context had changed, the 60 days of scrutiny hanging in the air like smoke, but the moment remained identical to the one where he first stepped forward. Silas looked up at Lyra, discarding the prepared legal script the Trade Coalition had tried to force into his hands. He spoke in his native tongue, the rough, unrefined sounds of English echoing against the light drinking stone of Ethel Alpha. He didn't call her Archon. He didn't call her Sovereign. He addressed her simply as Lyra, acknowledging that while his life was a seasonal blossom in a garden of ancient cedars, he was the only one in the room who wasn't looking at her as a territory to be conquered. The court held its breath, 100 different species waiting for the Archon to signal the guards to remove the interruption. Prime Adjudicator Valerius stood ready to strike the record, his sallow face twisted in anticipation of the human's failure. Lyra stood. It was a breach of protocol so severe it was as if the pillars of the hall itself had begun to crumble. She didn't look at the adjudicators or the suitors. She looked at the man who had seen her bleeding beneath the mask. Her voice was steady, utilizing a pre-classical Ethelgard term that the translation drone struggled to find a modern equivalent for, finally settling on a phrase that lacked the weight of the original but carried the intent. Already decided. The ratification was a chaotic, legal blur, but the shift in the room was unmistakable. The calculated performance of the conclave had been shattered by a footnote. Later, in the quiet of the inner sanctum, far from the violet drip of the chandeliers, there was no court. There were no suitors. There was only a low-level observer and a woman who no longer had to pretend the Iron Throne was comfortable. They sat together in the dim light of a single, flickering terminal. The Archon's hands were no longer splayed and white-knuckled on the cold metal armrests. Instead, they were resting in her lap, soft and released, holding a small, worn piece of plastic with a jagged nub. The data stylus reflected the soft glow of the screen, its work finally finished.